On the Isle of Balfiera, off the western coast of High Rock, there stands a tower of grey adamantine metal that the scholars of Tamriel agree is the oldest made thing on the face of the world. They call it Adamantia, and the Direni Tower, and the Ur Tower, and by the most cautious of magical divinations, its raising is placed somewhere around the year 2500 of the Merethic era, which is to say, a span of time so distant that the era itself counts downward toward a year zero that the histories never quite reach. The tower's metal core is said to descend into the earth as far as the structure rises into the air, and it has never been thoroughly explored, and what lies at the bottom of it no living person can tell you. We begin here, on Balfiera, because this single tower gathers into one place nearly everything we are about to examine, and because the deeper we dig at its base, the less we seem to know, which is the strange and recurring condition of the matters this episode concerns. For the lore of the Elder Scrolls is not, in the main, a settled record. It is a body of myth, of partisan history, of scripture written by the very gods it describes, of prophecy that exists partly outside of time, and of accounts that flatly contradict one another and were never meant to be reconciled. Much of it was set down long after the events it describes, by writers who had their own reasons to shape what they wrote, and where two texts disagree, the world of Tamriel offers us no neutral arbiter to decide between them. And so, the great questions of that world remain open, not because no one has answered them, but because the answers multiply and refuse to resolve. And a careful reading leaves us with more uncertainty than we began with rather than less. This is what we mean by the mysteries of the Elder Scrolls. We do not mean small puzzles of plot, the locked door, or the missing artifact, the sort of thing a hero resolves by the end of an afternoon. We mean the deep instabilities at the heart of the setting itself, the questions the lore poses and then declines to close. How was the world made? And was the spirit who made it a betrayer or a liberator? What are the towers, and what do they hold up? What are the Elder Scrolls themselves, and who, if anyone, wrote them? Where did an entire race of people go in a single instant beneath a mountain, leaving no bodies behind? What happens when time itself comes apart at the seams? What is the secret that two beings in all of history are said to have learned? The secret of saying the word I and surviving it. And who, exactly, was the man who became the ninth god of the empire, given that the chief account of him is a document the empire itself condemned as heresy? These are the threads we will follow, and we will take them in turn, not as a chronicle marching tidily from the first event to the last, but as a scholar would take up a difficult subject, examining each riddle on its own terms, and weighing the texts that speak to it before moving on to the next. We will name those texts as we go, the in-game books that the world itself produced, the lore archives that gather and preserve them, and the developer writings that sit at the edge of the canon, half inside the world and half outside it, and we will say plainly, each time when a source is reliable and when it is propaganda, when it is the historical record set down in good faith, and when it is a confession of faith dressed up as history, or worse, a defense written by the guilty party. For these are matters where naming the source is half the work, where the question of who wrote a thing and why is inseparable from the question of whether to believe it, and where the same event will look entirely different depending on whose account we happen to be reading. And we should be honest, at the outset, about where all of this leads. For the honest answer to very nearly every question we are about to ask is that the world does not know, and, what is more remarkable, that the world tells us so itself, in its own texts, through its own scholars and priests and witnesses, who concede again and again that the thing in question is not understood. We are not, in these matters, uncovering secrets that the world has carefully hidden and that diligence will reveal. We are reading a world that has looked at its own deepest questions and admitted, in writing, that it cannot answer them. Let us begin, then, where the world begins, with the death of a god. Before the mortal plane there was the Orbis, and before the Orbis there were two forces whose meshing shaped everything that followed. The first of these is named Anu, who is associated with light, with stasis, with order, with the impulse of things to remain as they are. The second is named Padme, and in some tellings Sithis, who is the void itself, associated with change, with chaos, with the impulse of things to become other than they are. From the interaction of these two primordial forces came the Etada, a word that means the original spirits, and these are the beings the various peoples of Tamriel would later worship and fear as their gods. So the creation accounts agree at least this far, that the world has its origin in the tension between permanence and change, and that the gods are not the first things, but came out of something prior to themselves. Beyond this point, the agreement begins to fray. It is worth dwelling for a moment on how the lore presents this material, because the manner of its telling is itself part of the mystery. We do not receive the creation of the world as a single authoritative scripture, the way a people might receive the founding revelation of their faith. We receive it as a collection, gathered into the in-game book called the Monomyth, which sets the creation stories of several peoples beside one another, precisely so that a reader can see how far they diverge. There is the account the Altmer of the Somerset Isles tell of their own origins, and there is the Cyrodiilic account, sometimes preserved under the title of Shezar and the Divines, and there is the Nordic account, and the Yokudan account. And there is even a Daedric account that frames the whole affair from the side of the spirits who refuse the world. The Monomyth does not rank these. It does not present one as the true version and the others as the errors of lesser peoples. It lays them out as competing testimonies, and the very existence of such a book whose purpose is to display contradiction rather than to resolve it, tells us that the world of the Elder Scrolls regards its own origin as something no single people can claim to hold. And running alongside the Monomyth there is a further account again, the one preserved in the book called the Annotated Anwad, which retells the shaping of the world from the meeting of Anu and Padme through to the making of the mortal plane, and which agrees with the others in broad shape while differing in the details that matter most. The pattern is set from the very first page of the world's history, that there is no one version, and that the reader who wants the truth of it must read several versions at once and hold them all in suspension. For among the Etada there was a spirit whom the elves called Lorkhan, and whom the people of Cyrodiil called Shezar, the missing god, and whom the Nords called Shor, and whom the Yokudans called Sep. And this multiplicity of names is itself a warning that we are no longer on firm ground. This Lorkhan conceived of a project, or perhaps was the project's instrument rather than its author, the texts will not commit, and the project was Mundus, the mortal plane, the world of birth and death and time. To make it, Lorkhan persuaded or tricked a great many of the other spirits into pouring their own power into the work, and here the accounts divide along the deepest line in all of Elder Scrolls myth. For those spirits who committed themselves to Mundus were diminished by the act and bound to the world they had made, and they became the Aedra, a name that means our ancestors, and these are the 8 divines, and later the 9. And those spirits who refused the project or who withdrew from it before they were bound became the Daedra, a name that means precisely and pointedly not our ancestors. So the division between the gods of the temple and the princes of oblivion is, at its root, a division over whether to give oneself up to the making of the world, and Lorkhan stands at the center of that division as the one who asked. This distinction repays a closer look, because it is one of the few points on which the various accounts more or less converge, and it tells us something about how the peoples of Tamriel understood their own gods. The Aedra are the ancestors, the spirits who gave of themselves, who poured their power into the substance of the world, and were thereby reduced, made less than they had been, fixed in place, and bound to the fate of the thing they had made. They are weaker than the Daedra in the ordinary reckoning, because they spent their strength on creation, and they are present in the world in a way the Daedra are not, woven into its bones. The Daedra, by contrast, kept their power whole. They did not give themselves to Mundus, and so they were not diminished by it, and they remain in their own realms of oblivion, vast and undimmed and free, and they are not the ancestors of anyone, which is precisely what their name records. A great deal of the religious history of Tamriel turns on this single choice made at the dawn of things, the choice to commit or to withhold, and the peoples of the world line up their devotions accordingly, some honoring the bound ancestors who made the world and suffered for it, and some courting the free princes who refused. And at the hinge of that choice stands Lorkhan, who did not simply make the choice himself, but persuaded others to make it, who is the cause of the division rather than merely a figure on one side of it, which is why every account of the creation must reckon with him, and why no account of him can be neutral. The question that the lore will not answer is what Lorkhan was doing when he asked. By one reading, he is a deceiver who tricked the spirits into a trap, who cost them their immortality and their freedom, and bound them forever to a diminished and dying world, and who deserved everything that came to him after. By another reading, he is a benefactor, even a liberator, who gave the spirits the gift of mortality, which is the gift of being able to change and grow and beget, the gift of being something other than a static and perfect and frozen god. The in-game book called the Monomyth, which collects the creation myths of several peoples side by side and is the single most important source we have on these matters, does not choose between these readings, and it could not, because the peoples whose myths it collects do not agree. The Altmer of the Somerset Isles, who count the Aedra as their bound and suffering ancestors, tend to regard Lorkhan as the author of their fall. The Nords of Skyrim revere Shor as a hero of their own pantheon. And so the Monomyth lays the Altmer account and the Cyrodiilic account and the Nordic account and the Yokudan account and even a Daedric account side by side, and lets them contradict because there is no neutral narrator of the creation in the world of the Elder Scrolls, and there never was meant to be. What the accounts do broadly share is the ending. With Mundus stabilizing and the spirits committed and bound, the gods convened, and by many tellings, they convened atop the adamantine tower on Balfiera, the very tower where we began, and there they sat in judgment of Lorkhan for his deception, and the judgment was carried out upon his heart. By the Altmeri account, it was Auriel, their own chief god, who tore the heart from Lorkhan's body, and by the more widely known account, it was Trinimac, the strongest of the elven spirits, who did the deed. The accounts cannot agree even on the executioner, but they agree on what followed, that the heart could not be destroyed. When the gods tried to unmake it, it would not be unmade, and the in-game Monomyth preserves, in the Cyrodiilic telling called Shezar and the Divines, the moment of the attempt. When Trinimac and Auriel tried to destroy the heart of Lorkhan, the text says, it laughed at them, and it said, "This heart is the heart of the world, for one was made to satisfy the other. Because the heart could not be unmade, it was instead cast out, flung or shot across the breadth of Tamriel, and where it fell, it struck the earth of Morrowind and raised up a mountain, and that mountain is Red Mountain, and the heart lies beneath it still." This event, the death and casting out of Lorkhan, marks the end of the Dawn era and the beginning of the Merethic era, which is to say, it marks the moment the world passed from myth into something the histories can begin, however unreliably, to count. There is a further reason the casting out of the heart matters to everything that follows, and it is a thread we will pick up again and again across this episode, for the heart did not simply die and lie inert beneath its mountain. It laughed at the gods who tried to destroy it, and it named itself the heart of the world, and it remained, indestructible, buried but potent, beneath Red Mountain in Morrowind. That single object, the surviving heart of the Deadmaker, becomes the hinge on which several of the later mysteries turn. It is what the Dwemer would one day mine down to and try to harness. It is what the Tribunal would one day strike to make themselves into gods, and the mountain it raised would itself be counted among the towers that hold the world together. So the death of Lorkhan is not an event sealed in the deep past, finished and done, but the planting of a seed that grows up through the whole history of the world, and the heart beneath the mountain is the most consequential object in all the lore, precisely because it would not be destroyed. The gods could cast it out, but they could not be rid of it, and everything that the Dwemer and the Tribunal and the Numidium would later become traces back to that failure to unmake what Lorkhan had been. And so we have, at the very root of the setting, a mystery that cannot be solved because it is not a question of fact, but a question of faith. Whether the maker of the world was its betrayer or its liberator, whether mortality is a curse the spirits were tricked into or a gift they were given, is not something the lore withholds out of coyness to be revealed in some later text. It is something the lore presents as genuinely undecided, a matter on which the peoples of Tamriel disagree as deeply as they disagree about anything, and on which we, reading their scriptures from outside, are given no ground to stand on that is not already someone's altar. And we should resist, as the lore itself resists, the temptation to settle the matter by picking the account that pleases us, for to take the Nordic shore as the true Lorkhan and dismiss the Altmeri reckoning, or to take the Altmeri judgment and dismiss the Nords, is simply to choose a side in a dispute the world has left open, and to mistake a preference for a finding. The honest position, the position a careful reader is forced into, is that the maker of the world is a figure on whom the world's own peoples cannot agree, and that this disagreement is not a flaw to be corrected, but the actual condition of the record. We turn now from the death of the god to the architecture his death left behind, to the towers, of which the one on Balfiera is the first. The towers are perhaps the strangest of all the structures in the lore, because the lore tells us they are enormously important, and then tells us in nearly the same breath that no one knows what they are for. What we are given is this: the towers are ancient and immensely powerful structures, and they are held to keep Mundus itself from dissolving back into the chaos of oblivion from which it was carved, to hold the mortal world together against the constant pressure of the void to unmake it. Each tower is paired with a stone, which serves as its power source, sometimes called its zero stone, the seed or anchor from which the tower draws its reality. And the first of them, the eldest, the template after which all the others were raised, is the Adamantine Tower on Balfiera, which the lore calls Adamantia, and which by its position at the head of the list is sometimes named Tower Zero. After it came the others, and it is worth naming them, because the list itself is part of what makes the towers so strange a subject. There is the White Gold Tower, the great spire of the Aelids that dominates the imperial city at the center of Cyrodiil, and the lore tells us plainly that the Aelids raised it in open emulation of Adamantia, that it is a deliberate copy of the first tower, and its paired stone is the Kimmel Adabal, which the world came to know as the Amulet of Kings, the gem in which the souls of the Septim Emperors were bound. That single detail, that the stone of the White Gold Tower and the Amulet of Kings are one and the same object, binds the towers directly into the political and religious history of the Empire, for the Amulet of Kings is not an obscure relic, but the central regalia of imperial legitimacy, the thing an emperor must hold to be an emperor. And to learn that it is also the power source of a tower is to learn that the holding up of the world and the rule of Cyrodiil were, in the minds of those who built the spire, the same act. There is the Red Tower, which is Red Mountain itself, raised by the fallen heart of Lorkhan, so that the very mountain over the dead god's heart is counted among the towers that hold the world together. And here we see the heart returning again, no longer merely a buried object, but a tower in its own right, its stone, the heart itself. There is crystal-like law, the crystal tower of the Altmer on Somerset, the seat of their oldest learning. There is Snow Throat, which is the throat of the world, the great mountain at the center of Skyrim, the highest peak in all of Tamriel. There is Green Sap, also called the Mother, sometimes associated with the Tower of Ivia, the living tower of the Bosmer in Valenwood. There is Orichalk, the tower of the Yokudans, which now lies beneath the sea with their drowned homeland, a tower lost with the land that bore it. And there is Walkbrass, which is not a building at all, but a walking thing, the great brass golem the Dwemer built, and the world would come to call the Numidium, a tower that moves, a fact we will return to when we come to the Dwemer themselves, and which already begins to suggest how far the category of tower can be stretched. For if a mountain can be a tower, and a walking golem can be a tower, then we are plainly not dealing with a list of buildings, but with something stranger, a set of objects united by a function the lore can name, but not fully explain. But here is the difficulty with the towers, and it is a difficulty the lore states openly rather than hiding. The full list of them, and the precise pairing of each tower with its stone, is not handed down in any single authoritative catalogue within the world. It is assembled by the lore scholars of Tamriel out of scattered hints, out of a line in the 36 lessons of Vivek, out of a reference in a forgotten book, out of what could be observed in the cities of the Aelids and the temples of the Altmer, and out of the writings recovered during the events that the chroniclers of the Second Era set down. The schema of the towers, in other words, is a reconstruction, pieced together by scholars from fragments scattered across many texts and ages, and not a doctrine handed down whole. This matters, because it means that some of what we have said about the towers, some of the pairings of tower and stone, the precise membership of the list, the very count of how many there are, is inference rather than record, a scholarly best guess assembled from the surviving hints, and a careful reader has to hold those parts of the picture more lightly than a name carved in stone. We can be confident of Adamantia and its primacy, confident of the white gold tower and its stone the Amulet of Kings, confident that Red Mountain and the Numidium belong to the set, because these are well attested in the texts. We are on softer ground when we extend the list to its furthest members and fix each one to its stone, because there the record thins into suggestion, and the schema becomes the work of the scholars filling gaps rather than the testimony of the world itself. And the central thing, the purpose of the towers, the question of how exactly an adamantine spire or a brass golem or a mountain over a buried heart could be holding the entire mortal world in being against the pull of oblivion, this is not explained anywhere. The lore says the tower's true purpose has remained a mystery, and it means this not as a flourish but as a statement of the actual state of knowledge. We are told what the towers do, that they hold Mundus together against its dissolution back into the void, and we are told that each is anchored by a stone, and we are shown the towers themselves, standing in their provinces, but the mechanism by which they accomplish their work is simply not given, and the texts that describe them stop at the threshold of that question. The metal heart of Adamantia descends into the earth as far as the tower rises, and it has never been fully explored, so that even the physical extent of the first and greatest tower is unknown. Its lower reaches a darkness no one has charted. And the deeper one goes into the subject, the more the certainties thin out, until one is left holding a handful of hints and a structure older than the histories that no one has reached the bottom of. It is a peculiar condition for a thing to be in, to be both the most important architecture in the world, the architecture on which the world's continued existence is said to depend, and at the same time the architecture about whose workings the world knows the least. We move now from the towers to a different kind of object, one that does not hold up the world but reads it, or perhaps writes it, and that is as poorly understood as anything the lore contains. We come to the Elder Scrolls themselves, the objects that give the whole series its name, and which, fittingly, no one in the world of Tamriel fully understands either. The Elder Scrolls are objects of prophecy, and the lore is careful to tell us that they exist partly outside of time, which is the source of nearly everything strange about them. They are kept and read by an order called the Cult of the Ancestor Moth, whose readers are the Moth Priests, sometimes called the Augurs, and the reading of a scroll is not a matter of unrolling it and looking, because the words of a scroll cannot be perceived by ordinary sight. Instead, there is a ritual of the ancestor moth, a discipline preserved by the cult and described in the lore in some detail, in which bark is drawn in long strips from a canticle tree in such a way as to summon the ancestor moths themselves. And the presence of these moths grants the priest a kind of second sight, the sight that can perceive what a scroll actually says. The whole apparatus of the cult, the moths, the canticle trees, the careful drawing of the bark, exists for this single purpose: to make the unreadable readable, to grant a mortal the brief and costly capacity to look upon a thing that ordinary sight slides off, and the elaborateness of the ritual is itself a measure of how far outside the normal order of the world the scrolls sit. One does not simply read an Elder Scroll. One prepares, through a trained order and an inherited right and the summoning of the moths, to be allowed to read it, and even then the reading is dangerous. And the price of that sight is the priest's own eyes. To read an Elder Scroll is to be blinded by it, partially at first, and with repeated readings the blindness deepens until it is total, so that the most experienced and learned readers of the scrolls, those who have given the most to the work, are precisely the ones who can no longer see. This is one of the more striking arrangements in all the lore, that the order, whose entire purpose is to read, possesses, in its most senior members, those who have read the most and read the deepest, exactly the people who have been rendered blind by the reading. The mastery and the blindness arrive together, and they arrive in proportion, so that to rise within the cult is to lose, by degrees, the very sense the cult exists to exercise. They trade their sight for the prophecies, knowingly, and they go blind in the service of reading the future, and there is no version of the practice in which the reading comes without the cost. It is a thing freely chosen and fully understood by those who choose it, and it tells us a great deal about the nature of the scrolls, that the world has never found a way to read them safely, that even the dedicated order built around the task pays for each reading in sight, and that the price only rises the more one reads. But the strangest property of the scrolls is not the price they exact, it is that what they say is not fixed. The prophecies they contain are described not as a settled text engraved once and forever, the way we might imagine a prophecy to be, fixed and final and merely waiting to be read, but as a living and fluid thing, a future that can be and has been rewritten by the deeds of mortal heroes, so that a prophecy read at one time may not read the same at another, because the world has moved beneath it and the scroll has moved with it. This is a profound and unsettling thing for an object of prophecy to be. We ordinarily think of a prophecy as a window onto a fixed thing, a foretelling of an outcome already set, and the whole point of reading it is to learn what cannot be changed. But the scrolls are not that. They are bound up with a future that is still being made, that the actions of heroes can and do alter, and so the scroll and the future it describes move together, neither one simply preceding the other. And this raises a question the Lord does not answer, and perhaps cannot, the question of whether the scrolls describe the future, or in some manner help to make it, whether they are a record of what will be, or a participant in bringing it about, and whether, for an object that sits partly outside of time, that distinction even holds at all. To stand outside of time is to stand outside the very order in which cause comes before effect, and the foretelling comes before the foretold, and the scrolls, sitting partly in that condition, do not behave as ordinary prophecies do. And there is one further property, which will matter very much when we come to the breaking of time itself, and it is this: the Elder Scrolls cannot look back upon a dragon break. There are moments in the history of the world that not even the scrolls can read, stretches of time that are simply blank to them, blind spots in the record of prophecy, and we will come to what causes them when we reach the dragon break in its own turn. For now, it is enough to mark the strangeness of it, that an object which sees partly outside of time, which can perceive the future that ordinary sight cannot reach, is nonetheless blind to certain places in the past, the places where time itself came apart. The fluid future the scrolls can read, the broken past they cannot. For now it is enough to say that the readers of the scrolls, the moth priests who have given their very sight to the work, who have spent their eyes in the reading and know the scrolls more intimately than anyone alive, concede that the scrolls remain a great mystery and that their authorship, their origin, and their ultimate nature are simply unknown. No one knows who made the Elder Scrolls, or whether they were made at all in any ordinary sense, or what they truly are at their root. We have, in the Elder Scrolls, objects that name the entire series, that drive the prophecies of every age, that the order built around them gives its sight to read, and that the most learned people in the world, having given everything to the study of them, admit at the end that they do not understand them. It is a rare and honest thing for a body of lore to place at its own center an object it openly declares to be beyond its understanding, and to name that object the thing the whole world turns on. We turn now to the most famous mystery in all of the lore, the one that has occupied scholars within the world and readers of the lore outside it more than any other single question, the one that draws people to the subject in the first place and holds them in it longest. The question of what happened to the Dwemer. It is a mystery with a precise date and a precise place and a named architect, which gives it the appearance of a solvable problem, a thing that diligence might crack, and yet the closer one looks, the further the solution recedes, until one is left, as with everything else in this lore, holding several incompatible answers at once, and no means of choosing among them. The Dwemer were a people of the Mare, the Elves, though they are commonly called the Dwarves, and they were unlike any of their kin. Where the other elven peoples were bound up in religion and ancestor worship, in the veneration of the bound Aedra and the courting of the free Daedra, the Dwemer turned to reason, to engineering, to the working of metal and stone and tone, and they built cities of brass and great machines that still run in some of their ruins, untended, ages after the last of their makers walked away. The persistence of those machines is itself a kind of testimony, for a traveler who descends into a Dwemer ruin in the later ages finds the mechanisms of a vanished people still turning, still tending the empty halls, the makers gone but the made things continuing, the city long abandoned and yet its mechanisms never stilled. They spread their cities across Morrowind and into the lands around it, deep beneath the surface as well as upon it, and they were not, as we tend to imagine them, a single unified nation, but a scattering of clans who often warred among themselves, and it is important to hold this in mind because the event that ended them was bound up in a war, and the Dwemer were not strangers to war. A people who quarrel among their own clans and make war on their own kind is a people capable of the kind of ambition and the kind of secrecy that the end of the Dwemer would require, and we should not picture them as a single mind moving toward a single goal, but as a fractious and brilliant people among whom one architect's design could be pursued in the depths while the politics of the surface ran their own course. The event itself is dated, with unusual precision for these matters, to the year 700 of the First Era, and it took place at the Battle of Red Mountain, against the larger backdrop of the War of the First Council, and, beneath the surface of the world, the War of the Crag, the rebellion of the enslaved Falmer, to whom we will come in their own turn. The War of the First Council is the larger frame, the conflict in which the Dwemer and the Chimer, once allied, fell out and fought, and it is in the climactic battle of that war, at the foot of Red Mountain, that the Dwemer make their exit from history. So the disappearance does not occur in isolation, in some quiet experiment gone wrong, but in the middle of a great war, with armies in the field and the rebellion in the tunnels beneath, and this crowded and violent setting is part of what makes the event so hard to read, for there were many hands moving at once and many reasons for any of them to shape the story afterward. At the center of it stands one figure, the chief tonal architect of the Dwemer, a being named Kagrenak, and to understand what Kagrenak did, we must return to where this episode began, to the heart of Lorkhan, buried beneath Red Mountain. For the Dwemer, in their tunneling and their searching beneath the mountain, had found it. They had mined down to the heart of the dead god, the indestructible heart that laughed at the gods who tried to unmake it, the heart that had named itself the heart of the world, and Kagrenak, the master of their tonal craft, the foremost mind of a people whose foremost minds were already without equal in the working of metal and tone, conceived of a way to use it. He looked at the surviving heart of the slain maker, the most potent object in the world, and rather than worship it or fear it, in the manner of a people of reason, he set out to harness it. He forged 3 tools for the purpose, and the precision with which they were made tells us how exact and how dangerous the work was understood to be. The first was named Sunder, which was made to strike the heart with a measured and exact quantity of power, neither too little nor too much, drawing from the heart a controlled portion of its limitless force. The second was named Keening, which was made to cut and to focus the power that Sunder drew, to shape and direct the raw force into something that could be put to use. And the third was named Wraithguard, which was made to shield the wielder from the catastrophic forces the other 2 would unleash, so that the one who struck the heart would not be destroyed by the striking of it. That a tool of shielding was thought necessary at all tells us how perilous the act was reckoned to be, for one does not forge a guard against forces one expects to be mild, and the 3 tools together, the striker and the focuser and the shield, amount to a confession in metal that the Dwemer knew they were handling something that could annihilate them and build their instruments accordingly. And Kagrenak's aim with these 3 tools and the buried heart was nothing less than to make his people divine or immortal. And here we strike the first of the genuine uncertainties, for the texts differ on which of these 2 things he intended. To make a people divine and to make a people immortal are not the same ambition, the one a matter of becoming gods, and the other a matter merely of never dying, and the Lord does not settle, which Kagrenak sought, so that even the goal of the most consequential act in Dwemer history is preserved to us in 2 versions. What is clearer is the vessel. The power drawn from the heart was to be poured into a thing the Dwemer had built, a colossal golem of brass that they called Numidium, the brass god, also named Anumidum and Walk Brass, the very walking tower we noted among the towers earlier. The Dwemer, it seems, intended to use the heart of a dead god to make themselves into gods who would never die, or into immortals who would never need to be gods, and to give their new condition a body of brass that could walk across the world, a tower with legs, a god they had engineered and could move at will. It is, taken whole, one of the most audacious projects the lore records, a people of pure reason setting out to manufacture their own apotheosis from the raw material of a murdered god, and the fact that we cannot say exactly what they were reaching for, divinity or deathlessness, is the first sign of how completely the record of what they did would come apart. What happened when the heart was struck is the mystery, and it has 2 layers, the layer of fact and the layer of cause. And neither of them is settled, though the first is at least agreed upon in its outline, while the second is not agreed upon at all. The fact, such as the lore preserves it, is stark and strange, and it is the thing that has fascinated readers of this lore above all else. In a single moment, at the Battle of Red Mountain in the year 700 of the First Era, every Dwemer then living on the face of Nirn vanished. Not some of them, not those present at the battle, but every Dwemer everywhere, all of them, in the same instant. Whether they stood at Red Mountain or labored in a distant city or slept in a deep hall far from the fighting. And not killed, not slain in the battle and left where they fell, the way a defeated people is ordinarily destroyed, but simply gone, removed, absent, so that the standard accounts record the most telling detail of the whole event, that they left no corpses and no trace of conflict behind. There were no bodies. A people did not die at Red Mountain in the manner that peoples die, leaving their dead upon the field to be counted and buried. They ceased to be present in the world, and they left nothing of themselves behind to mark the manner of their going, no slain, no remains, nothing for the survivors to bury or to mourn over. What they left instead were their empty cities and their machines still running in the silence. The great mechanisms of the Dwemer turning on untended in halls from which every maker had vanished between one moment and the next. The works continuing while the workers were simply gone. A whole people, spread across a province and the lands beyond it, ceased to be present in the world in a single instant and left behind only their tools still moving in the dark. This is the central and astonishing fact, the thing that makes the fate of the Dwemer the most famous mystery in all the lore, and it is recorded as such in the lore archives that preserve the in-game accounts. The books titled The Battle of Red Mountain and Nerevar at Red Mountain among them, and it is the thing that every later theory, whatever it claims about cause or intention, must somehow contrive to explain. Any account of the Dwemer must answer not merely why they fell, but why they fell without a single body, all at once, everywhere, leaving their machines running behind them. But who struck the heart, and why, and to what end? The lore cannot agree, and the disagreement here is not a minor variation, but a fork that sends the whole history down different roads. By one account, it was Khagrenach himself who struck it, during the battle, deliberately carrying out his great design, so that the vanishing of the Dwemer would be the direct and intended result of their own architect's act, whether a triumph or a miscalculation. By another account, Khagrenach did not complete the work, and the Dwemer were lost not by their own hand, but by the hands of their enemies, for it was the three figures of the Chimer who would become the tribunal, the war leaders named Vivek and Almalexia and Sotasil, who took up Khagrenach's tools after the battle and struck the heart themselves, whether to stop the Dwemer's design from being completed, or to seize the power of the heart for their own ascension, or both at once. These are very different stories. In the one, the Dwemer destroy themselves reaching for godhood. In the other, they are destroyed by rivals who then take the prize the Dwemer were reaching for. And the difference is not academic, because it bears directly on the guilt or innocence of the tribunal, on whether they were the saviors of the world from a reckless experiment or the thieves of a power they had no right to. And the tribunal, as we shall see, were among those who wrote the history. And by a further wrinkle in the account, the strike that vanished the Dwemer may have been guided or willed by the Daedric prince Azura, whose hand moves through this whole history, so that even if it was the tribunal who struck, the will behind the striking may not have been wholly their own. So we cannot say with certainty even whose hand it was, Khagrenach's or the tribunal's, nor whose will moved that hand, the Dwemer's or the Chimer's or Azura's. And we certainly cannot say what the strike was meant to accomplish, because the accounts that describe it, the in-game books titled The Battle of Red Mountain and Nerevar at Red Mountain, and the War of the First Council among them, were written by partisan and fallible narrators, including narrators loyal to the tribunal, who, as we shall see, had every reason to shape the story to their own advantage. We are reading the testimony of the suspects, in other words, and we are reading it about the crime they are suspected of. And the deepest question, the fate of the Dwemer themselves, is the one the lore most thoroughly declines to answer. Were they destroyed outright, unmade by the forces released from the heart? Were they exiled, cast into some other realm of existence, alive but elsewhere, beyond the reach of the world? Were they scattered, dissolved into the very skin and substance of the world, so that they are in some sense still here but diffused beyond recognition? Or did they ascend, as some readings hold, succeeding in Khagrenach's design after all, achieving the divinity or the escape from mortality that he sought, so that their vanishing was not their death but their graduation out of the world entirely? The lore presents all of these as life possibilities and chooses none, and states in the plainest terms that the fate of the Dwemer is largely unknown. A whole people walked into a single moment beneath a mountain and did not walk out, and the world they left behind cannot tell us whether they died, fled, dispersed, or became gods. The aftermath of that day did not leave the survivors untouched, and the next death in the story is itself a mystery folded inside the larger one. Lord Indoril Nerevar, the great Khmer war leader who had led the alliance against the Dwemer and who was the close companion of the three who became the tribunal, died soon after the battle, and here too the account split along the same fault line as everything else in this history. By some, he died of wounds taken in the fighting, an honorable death in the field, the natural end of a war leader who had led from the front. By others, he was murdered by his own friends, the very three who became the tribunal, killed to keep him from interfering with what they meant to do with the power they had taken from the heart, so that the death of Nerevar becomes not a casualty of war, but the first crime of the new gods, the silencing of the one man who might have stopped them or exposed them. Which of these is true matters enormously, for it is the difference between 3 war leaders who mourned a fallen friend and 3 murderers who killed one, and the tribunal who wrote the history are once again the interested parties, and take the power they did. The tribunal used Kagurnak's tools and the heart to make themselves into living gods, the 3 god rulers of the Dunmer, ruling their people from the height of divinity, and for this act of seizing divine power, the Daedric prince Azura, whose warnings they had defied, laid a curse upon their entire people. The Khmer, who had been golden-skinned elves, were transformed, their skin turned to ash grey and their eyes to red, and they became the Dunmer, the Dark Elves, the people we know, marked forever in their very flesh by the act their leaders committed at Red Mountain, so that an entire people carried the visible sign of their ruler's transgression on their own faces for the rest of history. So the disappearance of the Dwemer is bound up with the murder of Nerevar and the curse that made the Dunmer. 3 events knotted together at the foot of one mountain, and the same handful of tools and the same buried heart lie at the root of all of them, and the same partisan narrators stand behind every account we have of any of it. This brings us to a problem that runs through the whole of the Dwemer mystery and far beyond it, the problem of the unreliable narrator, and it is worth pausing on because it is one of the things that makes the lore of the Elder Scrolls so resistant to a clean accounting. The tribunal, Vivec and Almalexia and Sota Sil were not merely participants in these events. They became gods, and they ruled their people as gods for thousands of years, and they were, by their own eventual admission and by the judgment of the lore, narrators of their own history who rewrote that history to suit them. They had betrayed Nerevar, or were widely believed to have done so, and they had stolen divine power from the heart, and they had every reason to obscure both of these things. And the scriptures that come down to us from their reign must be read with that knowledge always in hand. When a god writes the history of how he became a god, and that history happens to exonerate him of the murder of his friend and the theft of his power, we are not reading a record. We are reading a defense, and a brilliant one, and we have to read it as such. And nowhere is this clearer. Nowhere does the doubled nature of these sources show itself more sharply than in the scriptures of Vivec himself. The 36 lessons of Vivec, which we now take up, because they are at once 2 things that ought to be impossible to combine and yet are combined in this single text. They are our single most important in-world source on the deepest metaphysical mystery in all the lore, the mystery we are about to examine, and they are, at the very same time, a piece of deliberate propaganda by a god who had betrayed his friend and stolen his divinity and had every reason to obscure both. To read them is to take instruction on the highest secret of the world from a teacher we have already convicted on other matters of lying to protect himself. This is the heart of the matter we come to next, and it is the matter that draws more fascination than perhaps any other in the lore, the secret called Kim. Kim is a word from the Elnofex, the tongue of the old spirits, and it means royalty, and it is written the lore tells us, as a single syllable, the syllable I, whose shape is said to resemble a crowned tower, so that the very written form of the word is bound up with the towers we have already examined, and with the idea of rule, of sovereignty, of the self that stands and is not dissolved. And Kim is the name for the deepest and most dangerous secret in all of the lore, the secret of what is called walking the path of the tower. To understand it at all, even to state it, one must first accept the proposition on which it rests, and that proposition is itself one of the strangest claims the setting makes about its own nature, a claim that, if taken seriously, changes the meaning of everything else in the world. The proposition is this: the entire world, the whole of Mundus and everything within it, every land and every god and every living thing, is a dream, the dream of a single sleeping being whom the texts call the Godhead, and all the things that appear within that dream are, at the very deepest level, not many things at all, but one thing, undivided, a single being dreaming itself into the appearance of countless separate selves and separate places. The multiplicity we see, the division of the world into this person and that person, this god and that god, is on this account an appearance only, a seeming, and beneath it there is one dreamer dreaming all of it. And to realize this fully, not merely to entertain it as an idea, but to feel it with every sense, to know in one's whole being that one is not separate, that one's own individual self is an illusion within a single, boundless, dreaming being, is ordinarily to be annihilated by the knowing, for the self that truly grasps that it is not real cannot survive the grasping, and dissolves back into the oneness it has perceived. And Kim is the achievement of realizing all of this and not dissolving. It is the act of standing in the full and terrible knowledge that the world is a dream, that all is one, that the self is an illusion, and then, against the dissolution that by every right ought to follow, still managing to say the word I, to hold one's individual identity intact within the totality, to know oneself unreal and remain oneself nonetheless. It is, in a sense, the most extreme assertion of selfhood imaginable, the assertion of an I in the one circumstance where the I has every reason to vanish. The being who survives this, who attains Kim, is said to gain a freedom that can only be called godlike, the ability to edit reality itself, to reach into the dream and alter it, because such a being has woken up enough within the dream to change it, and yet not so much as to vanish. The clearest articulation we have of what this experience is comes not from a shipped in-game book at all, but from a developer text, a piece written outside of any game by Michael Kirkbride, who wrote much of the strangest and most influential material in the setting, and this text, called Vech's Teaching, is written in the voice of Vivek. It must be flagged for what it is: an out-of-game writing that Bethesda has never fully ratified, treated by much of the community as a kind of soft or semi-canon, but never engraved as settled in-world fact, and we should hold it accordingly. With that flag firmly in place, here's how that text describes the threshold of Kim. Imagine being able to feel with all of your senses the relentless alien terror that is God and your place in it, the text says, which is everywhere and therefore nowhere, and realizing that it means the total dissolution of your individuality into boundless being. Imagine that, the text continues, and then still being able to say I. That is the secret, the saying of I in the face of a knowledge that should make the word impossible. Only two beings in all the lore are widely held to have achieved this, and the smallness of that number is part of what gives Kim its weight. For in the whole long history of the world, across all its gods and heroes and god-kings, only two are said to have walked the path of the tower and lived. The first is Vivek himself, the poet-god of the tribunal, the same Vivek whose scriptures we have just been reading, and this is no coincidence, for it is precisely because Vivek is held to have attained Kim that his scriptures are our chief in-world source on it. He hid the secret in those scriptures deliberately, so that it could be passed to one who was ready, and yet not simply handed to one who was not, encoding the most dangerous knowledge in the world in a form that would protect the unready from it. The second is Tiber Septim, the man who became the god Talos, the founder of the empire, and by the most cited account, it was Talos who put the power of Kim to its most consequential use, reaching into the dream and erasing the jungles of Cyrodiil from history. For the early lore of the setting described Cyrodiil as a jungle province, a hot and forested land, and the later world shows it instead as a temperate heartland of plains and gentle hills. And the explanation the lore offers for this change is not that the chroniclers corrected an earlier error, but that the land itself was changed. That Talos, having attained Kim and gained the power to edit the dream, reached into the world and rewrote Cyrodiil so that it had always been the temperate heartland it became. The jungle, on this account, was not cut down or burned away, but unhappened, removed not from the present only, but from the past as well, so that it had never existed, and the very memory of it survives only in the older texts that were written before the change took hold, and were somehow not fully overwritten. This is as clear a demonstration as the lore offers of what Kim is supposed to make possible, the capacity not merely to alter the world going forward, but to reach back and revise what has always been true, and it is offered as the explanation for one of the genuine puzzles of the setting, the disagreement between the early descriptions of Cyrodiil and the later ones. We will return to Talos, because he is a mystery in his own right. But for now, he stands as the second of the two who are said to have walked the path of the tower and lived, and the one who is said to have used it to change the shape of the world. And there is a failure mode, for the path is lethal, and this is what raises Kim from a doctrine to a genuine peril. The seeker, who reaches the threshold of Kim and cannot hold the eye, who realizes the oneness of all things and is dissolved by it after all, who looks fully upon the dream and the dreaming Godhead, and is unmade by the looking, is not merely left unenlightened, sent away no wiser than before, but erased, negated, removed from existence altogether. And this erasure is called zero-sum. It is the negation of the self that follows from realizing the truth of the dream without the strength to remain a self within it. The dissolution that the attainment of Kim is precisely the act of surviving. So the two outcomes of the path stand very close together and could not be further apart in their consequence. The one who holds the eye gains the power to edit reality. The one who cannot hold it ceases to be. To seek Kim is therefore to risk zero-sum, to stake one's very existence on the ability to say a single word at the one moment when that word becomes hardest of all to say, and this is why only two beings in the history of the world are said to have made the attempt and lived, for the cost of failure is not pain or defeat, but annihilation, and few would gamble existence itself on the strength of their own held selfhood. And beyond Kim, at the very edge of what the lore proposes, there is one further step called Amaranth, and we must flag this even more heavily than the rest, for it rests almost entirely on the out-of-game writings and stands at the very furthest reach of the semi-canon, further out than anything else we have discussed. The idea of Amaranth is that the dreamer who attains the highest realization does not merely edit the existing dream, as the one who attains Kim is said to do, but wakes from it entirely and begins a new dream of their own, a new reality, becoming in effect a new Godhead, dreaming a new and separate world into being. If Kim is waking enough within the dream to change it, Amaranth is waking out of the dream altogether and dreaming a fresh one, the beginning of a wholly new creation rather than the revision of the old. It is the proposed step beyond godhood itself, the passage from being a power within a world to being the sleeping origin of a world, and it comes to us chiefly through Michael Kirkbride's writings made after Morrowind and the work called Coda, and it should always be understood as the developer's speculation at the very boundary of the canon, broadly known and discussed among those who follow the lore, but never engraved as settled in-world fact. The outermost edge of a body of metaphysics that grows less certain the further out one travels along it. What makes Kim a true mystery and not merely an obscure doctrine to be looked up and learned is the nature of its sources, and this is where the problem of the unreliable narrator returns to us in its sharpest form. Consider the position we are in. The clearest and most vivid statement of what the secret actually is, the passage about feeling the terror of God and still being able to say I, is a developer text, a writing made outside any ship game by Michael Kirkbride, and however influential and widely accepted that writing may be, it sits at the edge of the canon and not at its center, soft rather than settled. And the in-world scriptures that do contain the secret, that do treat of Kim from within the world itself, are the 36 lessons of Vivek, and they contain the secret on purpose in a form designed to conceal it. The lessons are riddling by intent, written by a poet god who meant to hide as much as he revealed, and at the very point where a reader, having followed the text to the threshold, expects the secret at last to be given, the text deliberately withholds it. The scripture states that the secret syllable of royalty is this, and then, in the place where the syllable itself should appear, where the reader leans in to receive it, the text supplies instead the words, "You must learn this elsewhere." The scripture names the existence of the secret, leads the reader to the very edge of it, and then refuses to speak it, sending the seeker away to find it by some other means. And it does so for a reason that is itself revealing, because its author, Vivek, meant the secret to be earned by the worthy and not simply handed to anyone who could read, and because Vivek, let us never forget, is the same God who rewrote the history of Red Mountain to conceal the murder of Nerevar and the theft of divine power from the heart, a narrator we have already found every reason to distrust on every other point. So consider what this leaves us with. Our best in-world source on the deepest secret in all the lore is a piece of deliberate propaganda by an unreliable god, which describes the secret and then pointedly omits the one thing that would resolve it. And our clearest source overall is a developer writing that the canon has never fully ratified. The mystery of Kim is, in a sense, a mystery about sources as much as about metaphysics, a question not only of what the secret is, but of how much weight a riddle written by a self-serving god and a flag of soft and unratified developer text can be made to bear. And the honest answer is that they can bear a great deal of fascination and very little certainty. We turn now from the breaking of the self to the breaking of time. The secret of Kim concerned what happens when a single being confronts the truth of the dream and either holds its eye or dissolves, the breaking or the keeping of oneself at the edge of the totality. The phenomenon we come to now concerns something larger, the breaking not of a self, but of the very order in which all selves and all events take place, the order of time itself, and the lore calls it the dragon break. It is among the most genuinely strange ideas the setting contains, stranger in its implications even than the dream of the Godhead, and it is one that, by its very definition, cannot be cleanly explained, because it is the one event in which clean explanation itself ceases to apply. To explain a thing is to say what happened and then what followed from it, in order, one after another, and a dragon break is precisely the suspension of that order, the period in which the orderly succession that explanation depends upon was not in force. We are in approaching it, trying to explain the unexplainable, and the lore knows this and says so. A dragon break is a rupture in linear time, and it is associated with Akatosh, who is the dragon god of time, the god whose continuity holds the orderly flow of one moment after another in its place, who is, in a sense, the guarantor that one thing happens after another and not all at once. When that continuity ruptures, when the dragon that is time itself breaks, time does not simply stop. as a stopped flow might, nor does it merely skip ahead, leaving a gap. Instead, it comes apart along its length, and during a dragon break, the ordinary rule that governs all events, the rule that mutually exclusive things cannot both be true, that if one outcome happens, then its rival outcome does not, simply ceases to hold. Events that contradict one another, events that cannot all be true at once because the truth of each denies the others, all happen at once anyway, and history fractures into a multiplicity of incompatible truths that are nonetheless, every one of them, true. The single orderly thread of what happened becomes a tangle of what happened, many threads at once, all of them real, none of them canceling the rest, and the contradiction is not resolved into a single outcome, but preserved as a knot of outcomes all holding true together. And when time at last knits itself back together, when the dragon mends and the ordinary flow resumes, the world is left to make what sense it can of a stretch of its own history in which everything possible occurred, in which the record does not narrow to one path but keeps all its branches. This is why the Elder Scrolls, those objects of prophecy that we examined earlier, those objects that see partly outside of time, cannot look back upon a dragon break, for there is no single thread of events there for them to read, no one line of what happened, only the fracture and the tangle. And the prophecy that can perceive the fluid future is nonetheless blind to the place where time itself broke and ran in all directions at once. The longest and most famous of these breaks is called the Middle Dawn, and it occurred in the First Era, and it is said to have lasted an extraordinary span, often cited as 1008 years, a millennium and more in which time was broken and history was a tangle. Let us hold that figure up for a moment, because it is a strange thing even to state. 1008 years is not a brief rupture, a moment of disorder soon mended, but a span longer than many of the empires of Tamriel have lasted from their founding to their fall, and the claim is that for the whole of that span time was broken, that history did not run in its ordinary single line, but stood fractured and tangled, with incompatible events all holding true at once. We should note at once, however, that this figure, 1008 years, is itself an in-world estimate rather than a certainty, and the difficulty of the estimate is plain on its face. For how does one measure the duration of a period in which duration itself had come apart? How does one count the years of a time in which the orderly counting of years had ceased to apply? The lore offers the number with the implicit caution that it is the best reckoning available, and not a fact established beyond doubt, a figure arrived at after the fact, looking back at a stretch of history that resists exactly the kind of measurement we would want to apply to it. The cause of the Middle Dawn is attributed to a sect of fanatics called the Marukadi Selective, who belonged to the Alessian Order, a man-centered and militantly anti-elven religious movement that rose to dominate Cyrodiil in the early First Era. To understand what drove them, we must recall the doubleness of one of the chief gods of Tamriel, for the dragon god of time was worshipped by men as Akatosh and by the elves as Auriel, the same Auriel who appears in the creation accounts as the one who, by the Altmeri telling, tore out the heart of Lorkhan. To the man-centered zealots of the Alessian Order, this was intolerable, that their own supreme god, the dragon god of time himself, should be bound up with or even identical to the chief god of the elves they despised, that the divine they worshipped should carry an elven face. And so, the Marukadi Selective, the most fanatical sect of that order, set out to do something that no ordinary act of worship or war could accomplish. They set out to purge the elven god from their human dragon god, to separate Akatosh from Auriel by force, to take a single divine being and split him along the seam of the two peoples who claimed him, keeping the man's god and casting out the elves. And to do this, they performed an act the lore can only gesture at, an act it describes, with a kind of helpless plainness, as dancing upon a tower. They danced upon the tower, the texts say, and in doing so, they wrenched at the structure of time itself, For to interfere with the dragon god of time is to interfere with the flow of time, and the result of their dance was not the clean separation they sought, but the middle dawn, the longest dragon break in the history of the world. 1,000 years and more of fractured time loosed upon Tamriel by a sect of zealots trying to remake a god. What actually happened when they danced, no one can say, and the lore says so directly. The in-game book that addresses these events, titled Where Were You When the Dragon Broke, is built out of contradictory eyewitness accounts gathered in the form of interviews, and it does not resolve them, because the contradictions are the point, and one of the voices in that text states the matter as plainly as it can be stated, that no one understands what happened when the Selectives danced on that tower. That is the honest summary, offered from within the world by people who lived nearer to the event than we ever can. There exists also a longer, extended version of that same text, which circulates as a forum post by Michael Kirkbride and should be cited separately as semi-canon, an out-of-game elaboration rather than a shipped book, and it deepens the strangeness without dispelling it. The shipped account and the developer account agree, at least on the central admission, that the thing is not understood. The Middle Dawn is the longest dragon break, but it is not the only one, and the second great example is closer to the events the games themselves portray and shows us, more clearly than any abstract description could, what a dragon break is and how the world uses it. It is called the Warp in the West, and also the Miracle of Peace, and it occurred in the year 417 of the Third Era, in the lands of Hammerfell and High Rock, far to the west of the Cyrodiil, where the Middle Dawn had broken time a whole era and more before. Its causes were twofold: the activation of the Numidium, that walking brass tower the Dwemer had built and which had long since passed out of Dwemer hands into other keeping, and the death of King Lysandus of Daggerfall. And at the moment of crisis there were 7 rival powers in the region, 7 factions each contending for control of the western lands, each with its own goal and its own claim and its own reason to want the power that the Numidium and its controlling instrument could confer. And in the Warp in the West, all 7 of them won. Each of the 7 seized the totem of Tiber Septim, the instrument by which the Numidium was commanded, and each seized it at the same time, the same single instrument in 7 hands at once, and each used it to achieve the outcome it sought. And all of these outcomes, which could not possibly all be true together, which contradicted one another at every point, became true together anyway, because time had broken and the rule that only one thing can happen at one place in one moment no longer held. Every faction's victory was real, and every incompatible ending occurred, so that the same totem was seized 7 times over by 7 different hands, and the same region was delivered 7 times over to 7 different masters, and none of these truths canceled the others, because during a dragon break, the cancellation of one truth by another, which is the ordinary work of time, simply ceased. And the world, when the break had run its course, simply absorbed the contradiction, knit itself back together around it, and went on with a history in which all 7 endings had happened at once, each faction holding the gains it had won, the map of the West redrawn into a shape that the ordinary logic of events could never have produced. It is worth saying plainly what the Warp in the West represents, because it is one of the more remarkable instances of the world's lore being honest about its own construction. The events of the second of the Elder Scrolls games allowed the player to deliver the region to any of several different powers, to choose among mutually exclusive endings, and rather than declaring one of those endings the true one and discarding the rest, the lore declared all of them true at once, and called the mechanism by which they were all true a dragon break. The contradiction was not resolved but enshrined, made into a feature of the world's history, so that the multiplicity of endings became the canonical record. And this, finally, is why a dragon break can never be cleanly explained, not because the explanation is hidden, but because the thing being explained is the suspension of explanation itself. The period in which the ordinary logic of one thing after another, the logic that any explanation depends on, was not in force. No mortal truly understands what happened, the lore says of the dragon break, and it is not being modest. It is describing a category of event that understanding, as we ordinarily mean the word, cannot reach. We come now to a mystery of a more personal kind, the riddle of a single man, or perhaps three men, the riddle of Talos, who became Tiber Septim, who became the ninth god of the empire. We have met him already as one of the two beings said to have attained Kim, but his godhood is only the end of a question that begins with the much stranger matter of who he actually was. Talos is the mortal who ascended to become the ninth divine, added to the 8 of the old pantheon to make the 9, worshipped across the whole of the empire he had founded, his cult woven into the religion of the state itself. And his godhood was no quiet matter of doctrine, for it became, in the later ages, a cause of war and of treaty, his worship banned in the settlement that followed the great war of the Fourth Era, so that the very question of whether Talos was a god to be worshipped at all became a point on which empires and peoples went to war and made peace. Few figures in the lore have a godhood so consequential and so contested in the affairs of the world. And yet, for all that the empire built its faith upon him and later empires fought over his worship, the texts that describe his origin do not agree on the most basic question of all, which is who he actually was, for they do not even describe a single man with a single life. The chief of these texts is titled The Arcturian Heresy, and we should mark that title at once and hold it in mind through everything that follows, for the world itself names this account a heresy, a document condemned by the very orthodoxy whose official history it contradicts, and it is precisely from this condemned and heretical source that the strangest and most influential account of Talos comes down to us. By the Arcturian heresy and the texts that travel in its company, Talos was not one person at all, but an oversoul, a single divine identity composed of as many as 3 distinct figures, 3 separate beings whose souls and stories were somehow gathered and fused into the one god the empire came to worship as Talos, the founder, the ninth divine. The first of the 3 is Hjalti Earlybeard, a war leader of mixed Breton and Nord descent, a conqueror, the man who in the Orthodox histories simply is Tiber Septim under his birth name, and it was Shalti, the account says, who was taught the Thuum, the voice, the power of speech that can shape the world, the same art the dragons and the old Nords wielded. And he was taught it not by a living master but by a long-dead Nord king, a spirit of the ancient North reaching forward across the centuries to instruct a living man in the power of the voice. Already, then, the founder of the empire is bound to the dead and to the oldest magic of the North before he has even begun his conquests. The second of the 3 is Weismir Wolfheart, called the Underking, a recurring Nordic spirit, a figure who appears and reappears through Nordic history, surfacing in age after age, a being who is less a single person with a single lifetime than a pattern that keeps returning, a soul that does not stay buried, and his presence in the oversoul of Talos binds the new god to the oldest and most persistent currents of the North, to a spirit that the North itself could not keep dead. And the third is Zurin Arctos, who was the imperial battle mage, the great sorcerer at the right hand of the new empire, and it was Arctos who built the Mantella, the enormous soul gem that would power the Numidium, the same brass tower we have met now several times, the walking god, the Dwemer maid, and the same Numidium whose later activation in the west broke time in the warp in the west. So the 3 figures said to compose Talos are a conqueror, taught the voice by a dead king, a recurring and undying spirit of the North, and the battle mage who built the soul engine of the brass god, 3 very different beings drawn from 3 very different corners of the world's magic and history, and the Arcturian heresy holds that these 3 were, in some manner, the texts strained to describe, fused into one, gathered into a single divine identity, an oversoul, so that the god the empire worships as Talos is not one man elevated, but three beings braided together into a single godhead. And the central dispute within this already disputed account concerns the mantella, the soul gem, and whose soul it actually held. For the mantella was powered by a soul, a vast and powerful soul torn from one of the figures in this story, and the texts cannot agree whose. By some, it held the soul of Zurin Arctus, the battle mage who built it, betrayed and devoured by the very engine he had made. By others, it held the soul of Ysmir Wulfharth, the Underking, the recurring spirit of the North. By others still, it held the soul of Tiber Septim himself, or some fusion of these, so that the question of whose soul lay at the heart of the brass, God is left genuinely and openly unresolved across the texts that address it. We cannot say which man's soul powered the Numidium, and the accounts that might tell us contradict one another, and the chief account among them is, by its own title, a heresy. This is the difficulty with the riddle of Talos, and it is a sharp one, because it sets two kinds of unreliable source directly against each other and gives us no neutral ground between them. The Orthodox histories of the Septim Empire present Tiber Septim as a single great man, a conqueror and a unifier, who rose by his own genius and became a god by his own worth, and they tell his story as the founding myth of the dynasty he established, with all the polish and all the convenient simplifications that a dynasty lavishes upon the memory of its founder. These histories have every reason to flatter, to smooth, to present a clean and singular and admirable origin for the line that ruled the empire, and we cannot take them at face value precisely because they are the official account of the very dynasty whose legitimacy they serve. And against those official histories stands the Arcturian heresy, which the Orthodoxy condemns by its very name, and which tells the stranger and darker story of the three souls. The Oversoul, the contested Mantella, the conqueror, taught his power by a dead king, the battle mage perhaps betrayed and devoured by the engine he built. This account too must be handled with care, for it is a heresy, a document outside the sanctioned tradition, with its own angle and its own quarrel with the orthodoxy it contradicts. So we are asked to choose between an official history with every reason to flatter and to simplify, and a heretical account with no official standing and its own reasons to subvert, and the two do not agree. And the Lord does not adjudicate between them, does not tell us which to trust. The man who became the ninth god of the empire may have been one man, as the dynasty insists, or three braided into one, as the heresy claims, and the chief source for the deeper and stranger story is by its own title a document the empire declared false. And so even the identity of one of the most important figures in the entire history of Tamriel, the founder of its greatest empire and the newest of its gods, is, at its root, a thing the world cannot settle, a question on which the official record and the condemned record stand opposed with no third voice to decide between them. We turn now to the last of our mysteries, and it is in some ways the most human, the most a matter of cruelty and consequence rather than of metaphysics, and it concerns a people who were nearly erased from the world, and whose erasure the lore cannot fully explain. We turn to the Snow Elves, the Falmer of Skyrim. The Snow Elves were once a great people of the north, the Falmer in the old naming, a civilization of Mer who dwelt in Skyrim before and during the rise of the Nords, possessed of their own culture and their own learning, a people in no way diminished or monstrous, the equals of any of the elven peoples of Tamriel. And they were broken in the conflict the lore remembers as the Night of Tears and the conquest that followed, the war in which the Nords, ascendant and growing, drove the Snow Elves from the surface of Skyrim, took their lands and their holds, and reduced the great people to a scattered and hunted remnant. We should pause on the completeness of this fall, for the Snow Elves did not merely lose a war and retreat to a smaller territory in the ordinary way of defeated peoples. They lost the surface of their homeland altogether, driven from the open country of Skyrim, dispossessed of the world above, and left with nowhere on the surface to go. Defeated, dispossessed, with their cities taken and their people scattered, and the Nords still pressing, the surviving snow elves did a desperate thing, the kind of thing only a people with no other choice would do. They sought asylum among the Dwemer, the deep-dwelling elves of the underground cities, the kin who lived beneath the very land the snow elves had lost, and they asked the dwarves for shelter and protection from the Nords who had broken them. To go underground, to place themselves in the keeping of the secretive and brilliant Dwemer, was to surrender a great deal, but the alternative was destruction at the hands of the Nords. And so the snow elves went down into the dark and asked for refuge. And the Dwemer agreed, and took the snow elves in, and what they did to them after is one of the more terrible acts the lore records, a betrayal of asylum so complete that it gave the victims their later name. For the price of their protection, the Dwemer fed their snow elf wards a toxic fungus, and this fungus blinded them, took the sight from an entire people who had come asking only for shelter, and over generations bred them down into a sightless and subservient race, a slave people laboring for the Dwemer in the dark. The cruelty of the method is worth pausing on, for the Dwemer did not simply enslave their guests by force of arms in the ordinary manner of conquerors, but blinded them first, took from them the sense by which they might have resisted or fled, or even seen clearly what was being done to them, and only then bound them to service. And these blinded and broken descendants of the proud snow elves came to be called the Betrayed, a name that is itself a verdict, for it names not what they became, but what was done to them, the betrayal of a refuge offered and then turned into a trap. The word carries the judgment of the lore, that this was a betrayal in the fullest sense, that a people who came seeking sanctuary from one enemy were instead enslaved and mutilated by the very host they had trusted to protect them, so that the snow elves, having fled the Nords above, found a worse fate among the Dwemer below. And over the long generations underground, in the dark, blind, enslaved, and bred for servitude, the Betrayed degenerated further still, losing not only their sight but their stature and their reason, descending across the ages into the twisted and monstrous creatures that the later world knows as the Falmer of the Deep, the savage and sightless things that haunt the abandoned Dwemer ruins and fall upon any who descend into them. These creatures, hostile and ruined, and barely recognizable as Mer at all, are the distant descendants of the once great snow elves, the same people who had a civilization and a learning of their own, reduced by betrayal and the long dark to the monsters of the deep places. They did not endure their slavery forever. They rose against the Dwemer in the underground rebellion the lore calls the War of the Crag, and here the threads of our mysteries cross once more, for the War of the Crag is the same conflict that formed part of the backdrop to the Battle of Red Mountain, so that the enslaved Falmer were in revolt against their Dwemer masters in the very age, and as part of the very upheaval in which the Dwemer themselves vanished from the world. The masters and the slaves were locked in their underground war at the moment the masters disappeared, and the snow elves, in their ruin, outlived the people who had ruined them. A few of the snow elves, the lore tells us, escaped this fate. There survive, in hidden places, a handful of uncorrupted snow elves who never took the Dwemer's poison and never fell into the slavery of the Betrayed, and one of these, a figure named Gelebor, endures into the later ages as a witness, perhaps the last clear witness to what his people were before their fall. And it is Gelebor who gives the mystery of the snow elves its final and most interesting turn, because Gelebor, a snow elf himself, does not entirely accept the standard account of his people's ruin. For the order of events is genuinely unclear in the lore, and the unclarity matters more than it might at first seem. The standard telling has the Dwemer blinding their wards with the toxic fungus and then enslaving them, the blinding coming first and the bondage after, but it is not settled which of two readings of that sequence is correct. By the one reading, the Dwemer blinded the snow elves defensively, out of caution or fear, to render a potentially dangerous refugee people harmless, a people who were, after all, desperate and numerous and not to be wholly trusted, and only afterward, having rendered them helpless, fell into reducing them to slavery. By the other reading, the enslavement was the intention from the very first, a cold design to acquire a captive labor force, and the blinding was merely the chosen method of securing it, a tool of subjugation, applied to a people who had come asking for help. The texts do not fix the sequence, and the difference between these two readings is the difference between a cruelty that began in fear and grew into bondage, and a cruelty that was bondage by design from the start, between a defensive measure that curdled and a calculated trap. It is the difference, in short, in the moral weight of one of the darker episodes the lore records, and the lore leaves it open. And beyond the order of events, Gelebor himself raises a deeper doubt, and his is the most interesting voice in the whole matter, because he speaks from inside it. He doubts that the toxin alone can account for what became of his people. He doubts that a blinding fungus, however terrible, however many generations it worked upon them, could by itself have produced the full degeneration of the proud and civilized snow elves into the monstrous, sightless, hostile Falmer of the deep, the collapse not merely of sight but of stature and of mind and of every trace of the people they had been. And he is recorded as suspecting that other forces may have been at play, some further cause beyond the poison, some additional agency working upon his people over the long ages in the dark, a cause he names only as a suspicion because he does not know what it was. Here we have something genuinely rare in all the lore, a first-hand witness, an actual surviving snow elf who lived before the fall and endured beyond it, looking upon the standard account of his own people's destruction and finding it insufficient, telling us plainly that he does not believe the accepted explanation is the whole truth, and that he suspects there is something more, some hidden cause, that the texts do not record and that he himself cannot name. It is one thing for the Lord to be uncertain about a distant event no living witness saw. It is another for it to preserve a surviving witness who looks at the explanation everyone gives and says that it cannot be the whole of it. The fall of the snow elves, like so much else in this world, is left not with an answer but with a witness pointing past the edge of what is known, gesturing toward a further cause that the record does not contain. We have walked now through the great mysteries of the world, the death of the Maker, the architecture of the towers, the unread scrolls, the vanished Dwemer, the broken time of the dragon breaks, the secret of Kim, the riddle of Talos, and the ruin of the snow elves. And it is worth, before we close, drawing back to see what they have in common, because they are not 8 unrelated puzzles, scattered and separate, but variations on a single condition that runs through the whole of the lore, and they are bound to one another by more than that shared condition. For one thing worth marking, before we come to the deeper point, is how tightly these mysteries are knotted together, how the same objects and the same hands recur from one to the next. The heart of Lorkhan, cast out at the death of the Maker, is the same heart the Dwemer mined beneath Red Mountain, and the same heart the tribunal struck to make themselves gods, and the mountain it raised is itself counted among the towers. The Numidium, the walking brass tower the Dwemer built to hold their stolen divinity, is the same Numidium that Zurin Arctus built the Mantella to power in the Tale of Talos, and the same Numidium whose activation in the west broke time in the warp in the west. The tribunal, who may have struck the heart and vanished the Dwemer, are the same Vivek whose scriptures hold the secret of Kim, the same partisan narrators whose unreliability shadows the whole account of Red Mountain. The Dwemer, who blinded and enslaved the snow elves, are the same Dwemer who vanished beneath the mountain, and the rebellion of those enslaved snow elves, the War of the Crag, is part of the very upheaval in which the Dwemer disappeared. And Auriel, who by the Altmeri telling tore out the heart of Lorkhan at the beginning, is the same Auriel whom the Marukati Selective tried to wrench out of Akatosh and so broke time in the Middle Dawn. The mysteries are not 8 separate doors, but 8 views into a single tangled chamber, and the same few terrible objects: the heart, the brass god, the tools, the towers, and the same few unreliable hands, the tribunal, the zealots, the Dwemer architect, appear again and again as one turns from mystery to mystery. To pull on any one thread is to feel the others move. In every case, the difficulty is not that the world lacks an account. It is that the world has too many accounts, and that they will not be reconciled, and that the texts which carry them were written by people or by gods with reasons to shape what they wrote. The creation of the world comes to us through the monomyth, which sets the contradicting faiths of 5 peoples side by side and refuses to choose. The fate of the Dwemer comes to us through books written by partisans of the tribunal, the very faction that may have struck the heart. The secret of Kim comes to us through Vivek's scriptures, which conceal it on purpose, and through a developer text that sits outside the canon. The Dragon Break comes to us through a book of deliberately contradictory eyewitness accounts, and is by its nature a thing that understanding cannot reach. The origin of Talos comes to us chiefly through a document the Empire condemned as heresy, and the ruin of the Snow Elves comes to us with its own surviving witness telling us the standard account is not enough. The mystery, in every case, is not a gap in the record, but a surplus of it, a record so full of competing and unreliable voices that no single truth can be drawn cleanly out. And this, we may say, is the deepest reason these matters remain open, and the reason they reward the careful reader rather than merely frustrating one. The world of the Elder Scrolls does not pretend to a single objective history handed down by a neutral chronicler who stood above the events and recorded them without interest or bias, because no such chronicler exists within that world, and the lore does not pretend that one does. What the world offers us instead is a great library of partial, partisan, faithful, and self-serving accounts. The monomyth with its contradicting creation faiths, the 36 lessons of Vivek with their hidden and withheld secret, the Arcturian heresy condemned by the very empire it describes, the book of Where Were You When the Dragon Broke with its deliberately irreconcilable eyewitnesses, the books of Red Mountain written by the partisans of the tribunal, each one true to its own author and false to its rivals, each one a window with a tint of its own. And the world asks us to read these texts as the scholars and priests of Tamriel themselves must read them, not by choosing one and discarding the rest, but with a steady knowledge of who wrote each of them and why, and with an equally steady willingness to say, at the point where the texts will not agree and no further evidence can be had, that we do not know, that the matter is not settled, that the record runs out here. The blind moth priests, who give their very sight to the reading of the scrolls, and then, having given everything, concede that the scrolls remain a great mystery, are perhaps the truest figures in all of this. They have spent their eyes in the study, they know the objects more deeply than anyone living, and they tell us, at the end of all their sacrifice, that the thing is not understood. That admission, repeated in one form or another across the whole library of the lore, is not a failure of the world to finish its own story. It is the shape of the story itself, the honest condition of a world that has looked at its own foundations and found them too deep to see the bottom of. We end where we began, on the Isle of Balfiera, at the foot of the Adamantine Tower, the oldest made thing on the face of the world, whose metal heart descends into the earth as far as the tower rises into the air, and which has never been thoroughly explored, and whose purpose, as with all the towers, is stated within the world itself to be a mystery. We do not know what it holds up, or how, or what waits at the bottom of its long descent into the dark. And the proper response to that, the response the lore itself models for us through its blinded priests and its contradicting scriptures and its honest admissions that no one understands, is not to invent an answer, but to stand at the foot of the tower and to read every account we are given with care, and to say, of the things that are not known, that they are not known. The mysteries of the Elder Scrolls are not riddles waiting to be solved. They are the honest record of a world that does not fully understand itself, and that is the most interesting thing about them, and the reason we return to them again.